Right. Good morning, everyone. My name's Elias, and this summer I spent working on invasion risk in the context of altered thermal regimes in the Great Lakes as a secondary analysis. And I was working under the mentorship of Drs. Rochelle Sturtevant with Michigan Sea Grant and Dr. Ashley Elgin with NOAA GLERL. Before I get into it, some acknowledgements. Thank you, of course, to my mentors and to Connor Shelley for all his help with mapping, as well as the rest of the GLANSIS team and everyone involved with the SeaGrant Summer Fellows Program for all of their support. About me, my name's Elias, mentioned that already. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. Originally from Minnesota, I'm a fourth year student at St. Olaf College, where I'm studying a couple of different degrees actually, but the most important one here is environmental science, a field that has previously brought me to Colorado and Oregon, studying and working on conservation and sustainability, and now here to SeaGrant. So over the last 12 weeks, I've been spending my time on two primary research questions. First, and more generally, what are the potential impacts of climate change on non-Indigenous species in the Great Lakes? Secondly, we want to know which species will pose a greater threat under climate change scenarios, which will pose a lesser risk, and what is that net change in risk? More specifically, we had a goal of identifying species that would pose a threat in mid-century conditions, so around 2050. We want to be able to tell resource managers, okay, here are the species you should be looking at, here are the taxonomic groups you should be looking at as cause for concern in your medium to long-term planning. Now, why were we doing this research? As everyone in this room is probably already aware, invasive species pose and have posed a major threat to the ecosystems of the Great Lakes. Species such as the sea lamprey or the zebra mussel have had major effects on native biodiversity and resources, and we spend millions of dollars each year trying to keep out more invasive species such as invasive carp. What we lack info on is how climate change is going to affect the likelihood of those species being able to establish in the Great Lakes, so being able to reproduce and overwinter under future conditions. There's a decent amount of literature on how climate change itself will affect ecosystem processes in the Great Lakes, as well as some of that literature focuses on native species. What it doesn't focus on is how climate change will be impacting invasive species. Most of that research has been done on a global scale, and there's very little focusing on the Great Lakes in particular, despite how unique of a habitat they are. The main resource that I used over the course of my research was the GLANSIS database. This was developed in 2003 by the team here at GLERL as an offshoot of the Non-Indigenous Aquatic Species Database, or NAS, which is run by the US Geological Survey. The GLANSIS database differs in that it focuses specifically on the Great Lakes as a region. So if a species is considered invasive to the Great Lakes but is native to California, for example, it'll appear in GLANSIS but not in the overall NAS database. Over the last several years, the audience of GLANSIS, which was originally designed for fellow scientific researchers, has expanded beyond just that audience to educators, policymakers, and resource managers within the Great Lakes. Now, most of the species that are listed in GLANSIS are ones that have already established in the Great Lakes. They're already invasive, they're already here and having an effect. But we also have 97 species that are considered as likely to invade, and those take on the form of a watch list. Every species on this watch list has its own fact sheet, same as the invasive species that are already established. What they also all have is risk assessments that assess their likelihood of being able to invade the Great Lakes. These are based on three qualities. Firstly, how likely are they to be introduced to the Great Lakes? Secondly, how likely are they to be able to establish, so reproduce and overwinter, after they've already been introduced? And thirdly, what are the potential impacts once they've established in socioeconomic factors, ecosystem factors, and even what potential impacts they might have? Now, there are three criteria for a species to be placed on this watch list. First of all, geographic. Are they from an area that's known to contribute invasive species to the Great Lakes, or are they from a region that has a similar climate profile to the Great Lakes? Second of all, are they an aquatic species? That one's fairly simple. Do they live in the water? Thirdly, establishment. They have to be assessed as either being likely to be able to establish in the Great Lakes, or be frequently introduced to the Great Lakes, or thirdly, they have to appear on a regulatory list for potential invasive species in the region. Now, how was I using this data? First of all, using the species profiles and risk assessments as listed in GLANSIS, I extracted all data that was either directly named as being potentially impacted by climate change, or characteristics of a species, such as like its nutrient tolerances, salinity tolerances, that the GLISA or other scientific literature indicated could be impacted by climate change in the Great Lakes. Secondly, I chose a variable, that being temperature, and graded each species based on its tolerance to different factors that are associated with that variable, such as potential to overwinter, tolerance of extreme water temperatures, and whether or not optimal conditions, such as those necessary for reproduction, were going to be present in each lake. Next, I combined all of those different factors for a quantitative variable based on whether or not a species was likely to find viable thermal habitat in at least one lake. And I did this in order for both current and 2050 conditions in order to have a direct comparison, which allowed me to remove 3 species that were deemed wholly unlikely to establish in both current and 2050 conditions. These are ones that were put on the watch list because they either had a high chance of introduction or because they were listed on regulatory lists. Now with 94 species, I was able to assign each of those to which lakes they would possibly be able to establish in. I then set that list aside. Next, I looked at the actual effect of climate change on those species, of how the changing conditions between the lakes and the species' preferred temperature range would overlap. So if a species benefits, its preferred temperature range is going to overlap more with the temperature range expected in the Great Lakes in future conditions. The inverse is true for if a species is likely to be hindered by climate change. That overlap in temperature range is going to decrease. Next, I combined those 2 factors, so whether or not climate change would have a beneficial, neutral, or negative impact on a species, and whether or not it would be able to actually find viable thermal habitat, in order to create a list of species that were likely to benefit from climate change and have a high threat of finding viable thermal habitat in the Great Lakes. Finally, I cross-referenced that list with the original risk assessment factors in order to note establishment limitations such as whether a species needs high salinity in order to reproduce. And thus, I was able to create a list of species that had an increasingly large likelihood of establishment in the long run. So who's benefiting from climate change? Well, most of the species on the list, as it turns out, or a significant amount of them. We saw about 46% of the species on the list experiencing a benefit from climate change, which in comparison to those experiencing detrimental effects, 6%, that's a pretty stark difference. About a third of the species experienced a neutral effect, so that change in overlap was minimal to none. And then around 15%, we just didn't have enough data to figure out how climate change would be impacting them. Our confidence in these figures is still pretty high though. Even if we added that 15% of unknown species to the number that are predicted to experience detrimental effects, that still makes up less than half of the number that are expected to benefit. We can break this down further into which taxonomic groups are expected to benefit from climate change. Here we can see a basic breakdown of the taxonomic groups represented on the watch list. Fishes and crustaceans dominate heavily. Plants follow up. But then we can look at the number that are just likely to benefit, the percentage of taxonomic species that are likely to benefit. We see plants expand greatly in how they dominate that list, as well as, oh, that's interesting. Apparently the herps category has disappeared from the pie chart, but herps also expand to about 11% of the pie chart. We can also isolate this to be more obvious in terms of which species benefit by looking at their individual percentages. Plants, we have an average of about 45% of species on the total watch list that are likely to benefit from climate change. Algae and fishes both show this average pretty well. Plants, however, have about 72% of their taxonomic group that's expected to benefit from climate change. And herps, that is reptiles and amphibians, every single species on the list is expected to benefit. Of course, whether a species benefits from climate change is only half the story. We also want to know who's actually going to have viable thermal habitat in the Great Lakes. And the answer to that question, it's not herps and plants. Instead, crustaceans and fishes as well as miscellaneous species on the list, which were ones where the taxonomic group simply had very few and didn't merit their own category. They tend to maintain fairly high likelihoods of finding viable thermal habitat in the Great Lakes. Of course, due to the nature of the watch list, where an establishment is a major part of whether or not species make it on, several species already have a high viability of finding habitat in the Great Lakes. But what we see as we move from current conditions to 2050 conditions is those species with a high or medium viability, that likelihood, that's getting higher. And species with a low chance of finding habitat in current conditions, they're moving over to have a medium likelihood of finding habitat, or even a high one. Now, once we combine those results, the results for thermal habitat and benefiting from climate change, we have some kind of predictable figures. Crustaceans and fishes are both potentially going to be posing a high threat. But what's interesting is that plants are as well. There's enough plants that are both benefiting and at a high chance of finding viable thermal habitat that they make up actually the highest number of species here, or highest percentage based on taxonomic group. Now, herps look like they're following that up pretty closely, but the thing to keep in mind with the sample size there is that there's only 5 reptiles and amphibians on the list. So that 20% that's tailing the fishes, that's only one turtle. Now, what we want to know then is what lakes have the highest number of species that might be able to find habitat in them. This map shows the number of species that are predicted to find viable thermal habitat between current and 2050 conditions. The most obvious thing here is that Superior jumps heavily. It goes, if I recall correctly, from 66 potential species to 77, equal to what Huron is in current conditions. Huron is the next most obvious. It goes up to 83 species, which is equivalent to, in current conditions, only the potential viable habitat found in Lake Erie. We also see a narrowing of overall range. Lakes like Erie and Michigan, which were very strong outliers in current conditions, tend to stay fairly stable in terms of how many species will likely be able to establish there. Whereas lakes like Huron and Superior, they're starting to catch up. An interesting thing here that isn't able to be seen on the map due to the high limitation of 83 species is that Erie and Michigan actually swap places in terms of which one is leading for the amount of potential species. In current conditions, we can see that Michigan is slightly behind Erie. In the future, it's leading just a little bit. Now, it doesn't lead by a number that can give us any strong confidence in future trends, but it's something to keep an eye on. We also see from that decreasing rate of viable species in Erie and Michigan that there might be a potential limit as to how many species on the watch list can actually establish in those lakes. As the climate continues to warm, we can see that more species might go the way of the European smelt, which in current conditions has a possibility of establishing in most of the lakes. But in the future, it's limited only to Lake Superior, the coldest. Now, what's the use of all this information? First of all, it's immensely useful for research management and planning. We can look at what species taxa we want to put our defensive energy towards in keeping out of the lakes because we know that they're the most likely to be able to establish and expand within those ecosystems. In the very long term, we can look at potential trends into the late century conditions and even 22nd century conditions. We can predict that plants and herps, for instance, are likely to move more into that high viable thermal habitat category, while Erie, on the other hand, might start getting to be too warm for species, and Michigan and Huron might tend to be more of a hotspot. We can also look at where to potentially focus future research. We know which taxa might be more threatening, and we can identify gaps in that research as to which taxa we don't have a ton of information on, which taxa are on the watch list, but there isn't a ton of literature available yet. There are several advantages to how I conducted this research. First of all, the database that I was using, GLANSIS, is very stable. Since the watch list's initiation in 2016, the methodology for determining what species are added and how those species are assessed has remained pretty much entirely unchanged for that nearly a decade period. Secondly, the variable that I selected, that being temperature, that has a ton of data available for past conditions in the Great Lakes. We've got all of these records that my colleagues have already talked about, and there's plenty of modeling available as to how those conditions are likely to change in the future. Of course, there are also plenty of limitations to the research. For one thing, we've got a lack of information on several species, and there's also just a lack of species on the watch list, and there's two reasons for this. For one thing, there's a stark difference in which species get researched. It's far easier and potentially more fun to find information on large species such as fishes and crustaceans than it is to look at tiny little diatoms. So we see this taking effect with, for instance, our gastropod group. 0% of the gastropods were predicted to benefit from climate change, but our sample size there was exactly one snail, so we can't really extrapolate that to all gastropods. Secondly, the establishment qualification on the watch list refers to current conditions only. So if there's a species on the watch list, or potentially on the watch list, that's assessed as unlikely to establish in current conditions, but might be able to establish in the future, we don't know that. That species would not have been a part of this research. Finally, we lack data on specifically winter conditions in the Great Lakes. And I know this is something that my colleagues and research at GLERL has also been hoping to address. Specifically, under ice projections are very hard to come by for future conditions. So determining whether or not a species was able to overwinter proved particularly difficult. Now, where might we go in terms of future research? For one thing, it'd be really interesting to look at how climate change is likely to impact those other two factors for the watch list conditions, that being vectors of introduction and potential impact on the Great Lakes. I'd be especially interested in looking at vectors of introduction. There's some previous research out there, for instance, Buckley et al. From 2021, that looked into how changes in population growth in Ontario is likely to impact the introduction of species via factors like escape from aquariums or from commercial culture. But it'd also be interesting to be able to do interdisciplinary research on the other factors that are looked at for introduction, such as shipping routes or overall commercial culture in the total Great Lakes area. Secondly, it'd be useful to use these techniques to look at expansion of current invasives within the Great Lakes. We can extrapolate from this research that specific taxa might be more likely to expand, say, towards Huron or Superior, but it'd be nice to have that concrete data based on the actual species that are there instead of just guessing. Finally, it'd be nice to be able to expand the scope. Several of the species on the watch list are ones that prefer stream habitats, and I was only looking at the Great Lakes specifically. Of course, those stream habitats, the establishment of invasive species there has a significant impact on the entire watershed. And as we can see, that's a pretty big watershed. So knowing what species are likely to establish upstream will give us information as to how the water quality of the Great Lakes and those different basins might be impacted in the future, which would be very helpful. Yeah, that's been my research. Any questions?
Great job, Elias. We've got questions.
For your climate data that you used for your projections, which SSP or RCP scenario did you select for that?
I did not select a specific scenario due to the number of factors I was looking at, such as ice coverage, just estimated lake surface temperature. I was using a variety of different scientific literature, including, primarily I was looking at the ones that are cited in GLESA, which I don't remember the full acronym there, but I know it's based out of here at GLERL and SeaGrant. And I believe Ronnie's going to be coming up and talking more about the projections that are used in that database, but I do not recall offhand the specific ones that are used across that breadth of literature.
Okay, I didn't catch all the folks that are a part of your the team that was working with you, but this work ties into Annex 6, which is for aquatic invasive species. So our lab supports the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. There are 10 annexes. So I'm curious if Ashley Elgin is a part of the team that was working with you.
Yeah, she is one
Okay.
of my mentors, but I didn't get as much time working with her specifically since
Oh,
she's out in Muskegon.
okay. Yeah, I think that this would tie in really well with that. And I'm just curious in terms of the work that they've done, how it would compare to the insights that you gained based on just your temperature work that you're doing. But I agree that when you add in other variables such as winter conditions and ice cover, that you will likely get some different outcomes. But I am very curious, how it compares to other work that's already out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. I think Danny was next.
Hi, Elias. I was curious about kind of the inverse of your research question of how do you predict native species are going to benefit or be harmed by the changing climate? And how do your predictions about non-native species play into native species? Like, for example, you predicted fish are going to do like relatively well in the face of a changing climate. Does that mean native fish species are also going to be doing really well, or do you think they're going to be harmed because non-native fish species are going to be acting as competition with them?
Yeah, so from the literature that I looked at, it really depends on the fish species, the native fish species. Fish species that prefer that cold water habitat are obviously going to be experiencing detrimental effects, whereas warm water ones are potentially going to expand their range. However, since a lot of the species that are listed as invasive or potentially invasive on the watch list are ones that also are ranked as having like high competitive abilities such as high fertility, high ability to find resources, I would suspect that the introduction of those invasive species would still prove quite detrimental to native ones.
Thank you.
Hey, great presentation. On the map that you showed, like the current and 2050 results, I noticed Ontario didn't change that much. Do you know why that might be?
If I had to speculate, Ontario's kind of in the middle range in terms of like latitude and such, and doesn't receive all the same like heavy industrial use, nutrient use that Lake Erie does. So it's kind of just sitting there without the extreme effects that we see in high northern lakes or southern lakes. But I think it'd be interesting to look more into that and to look more at climate data for Ontario specifically.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Elias, great talk. I'll keep mine brief because I know we probably got to move along. I kept thinking about the food web, right? The change in the temperature and the change in other conditions that come with climate change. Presumably I'm not an ecologist, but presumably they affect the whole food web, and those kind of interactions between species would have to be important because, right, there's the thermal habitat, and then there's the, like, does it have enough, do these species have enough to like eat and live? Is there a way to take steps towards incorporating that into the work?
Yeah, so that was actually one of the factors that I originally looked at back in that first step where I was looking at different things that could be related to climate change was food web. The vast majority of the watch list species are ones that are considered dietary generalists. And so on the scoring for the risk assessments have a very high chance of finding whatever food they like in the Great Lakes. So I consider that probably not going to be as major of a impact on their potential establishment.
Okay, one last question.
Sorry, thank you. Interesting work. I have a question just for funsies. What other degrees are you working on at St. Olaf's?
I am also working on degrees in gender and sexuality studies, and according to several of my friends, also a history degree.
All right, thank you very much, Elias. Great job.